The clay is cool against your fingertips. Not simply cool in the ordinary way museum objects are cool, but old cool, deep cool. 4,000 years cool. In the climate-controlled vault beneath the museum in Oxford, you are holding a small terracotta prism about the size of a thick candle. Its four faces crowded with wedge-shaped marks so fine they resemble bird tracks pressed into drying mud. The catalog number reads WB1923.444. The Weld Blundell Prism, found in Iraq in 1922. Excavated from a room sealed since around 1800 BDE. And before you type where you are watching from, before you type the time where you are, pause for a moment over that simple fact. The hours you are about to mention, the minutes, the seconds, the structure inside the act of telling time itself. They come from the same world that pressed these signs into wet clay. The civilization that made this object gave your day its divisions. It gave your waiting its intervals. It gave your routine its invisible frame. The text on the prism is what we call the Sumerian king list. It presents itself not as a poem, not as a myth in the loose sense, not as a story told for symbolic pleasure, but as a record, a chronology, a list of rulers from the moment kingship descended from heaven down through the dynasties of historical Mesopotamia. In its later sections, scholars feel relatively comfortable. The names align with archaeology. The cities are real. The reign lengths begin to sound like something human life could contain. But at the beginning, the text becomes difficult. Not grammatically difficult, not materially difficult, intellectually difficult. Before the flood, it says 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Years, not generations, not eras, not vague ages of ancient splendor. Years. One king, Alulim, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Another, Enmenluana, for 43,200. Bad Tibira alone is given 3 kings whose reigns together span 108,000 years. Then after this impossible duration, the list pauses only long enough to say something very simple. Then the flood swept over. And after the flood, the numbers change. They do not merely shrink, they collapse. Rains fall from impossible magnitudes to 1,200 years, then 600, then slowly downward toward spans that begin at last to resemble the limits of human bodies. It feels less like exaggeration than discontinuity, as if the measurement changed, as if the unit changed, as if the thing being counted before the flood was not quite the same thing being counted after it, or as if the scribes preserved an older system without understanding its original scale. Mainstream scholarship has a clear answer. The opening section is mythology, prestige mathematics, symbolic antiquity. The list begins in legend and moves gradually into history. The first securely historical ruler, usually identified on the list, is much later, nearly halfway through its sequence. Everything before that is treated as memory stylized into impossibility. And yet something remains awkward, not because scholarship is careless, but because the object itself is stubborn. This prism and the fragmentary copies of the king list found elsewhere preserve the same structure. Pre-flood kings, impossible reign lengths, a flood, then a different world. And the people who copied these texts were not careless record keepers. Sumerian scribes could be painfully exact: grain tallies, labor assignments, property transfers, boundary disputes. They could be dry to the point of boredom, precise to the point of obsession. So why begin royal chronology this way? Why record the absurd in the grammar of administration? That question matters. Not why did they believe it. Ancient people believed many things. The sharper question is why they chose to write it down as history rather than story. They had mythic literature. They had hymns, epics, divine contests, songs of descent and return. They knew the difference in form. The king list is structured like a ledger. City, king, reign, next. City, king, reign, next. It has the coolness of a database. It does not sound like a fantasy trying to sound true. It sounds like record keeping, preserving something the scribes felt obliged to copy, even when the content had become difficult to inhabit. And inside that world of difficult inheritance, a term appears again and again across Sumerian literature from many cities and many centuries. Anunnaki, usually translated as gods. But the phrase carries another resonance too, something closer to those who from heaven to earth came. In administrative and religious texts alike, the Anunnaki are linked to kingship, to order, to the establishment of civilization itself. They are described as the ones who gave the me a word. Scholars often translate as divine powers, though the texts speak of them less like abstract virtues and more like transferable things. Things that can be given, taken, carried, stolen, bestowed, installed. The me include writing, metalwork architecture, irrigation mathematics, music law, medicine, city organization. The Sumerians do not usually say humanity slowly discovered these things through trial and accident. They say they were given. Given in completed action. Given and then preserved. Given and then managed by human beings who inherited systems older than themselves. If you treat all this as mythology, it remains fascinating. Ancient people crediting their gods with culture. That is recognizable. But if you take the king list as the Sumerians framed it, not as myth, but as memory in administrative form, the question becomes harder to dismiss. What if these texts are not speaking about gods in the loose supernatural sense we instinctively imagine? What if they are preserving source attribution? What if Anunnaki was the Sumerian name for whoever came before them and left behind functioning systems? Set the prism down for a moment. Look at your phone. Imagine the screen reading 3:47 p.m., 3 hours and 47 minutes after noon. Each hour divided into 60. Each minute divided into 60 again. That pattern did not come from Rome, not from Greece, not from modern engineering. It comes from Mesopotamia. It comes from the mathematical world that produced this prism, a world that said repeatedly that its most important knowledge was received. So the first question is not whether the object is real. It is in your hands. The second is not whether the systems endure. You use them constantly. The first real question is simpler, quieter, and more unsettling than the loud theories people prefer. Why did the Sumerians describe the beginning of civilization as an inheritance from before the flood? And why 4,000 years later are you still living inside that inheritance? To understand why that question lingers, you have to step out of the museum vault and back into southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, around 4,500 BCE. before the cities rose, before the tablets, before the prism. What stands there first are villages, agricultural settlements, mud brick houses, basic pottery, some irrigation, domesticated animals, grain cultivation, small populations. Useful competence certainly, but nothing that yet looks like the sudden architecture of civilization. Then within a span that feels long, until you compare it with the scale of history, the pattern shifts. Over only a few centuries, what had been villages becomes something else entirely. By around 3,500 BCE, there is Uruk, not a large village, not a glorified town, a city, a real urban center, monumental, organized, expansive, covering kilometers, holding tens of thousands of people, larger by some estimates than classical Athens would be much later, at the height of its intellectual prestige. And Uruk is not merely large, it is coordinated. That is the crucial difference. The White Temple, rising on its platform of mud brick. The buildings of the Anu district. Large halls, planned spaces, structures that required labor forces in the thousands, which means food surpluses, which means administration, which means surveying, which means accounting, which means architectural knowledge adequate to keep a heavy structure from sinking or splitting under its own weight. The city is not just physically present, it is intellectually present. A system has arrived. Writing appears in this same horizon, not writing in its final literary richness, not yet the epics and hymns copied later in scribal schools, but still something astonishing. A script already capable of handling administration, number, category, relation. The earliest tablets from Uruk are functional from the start. They count grain, livestock, labor, textiles. They already assume a bureaucracy. They already assume symbols tied to meaning in an organized way. Modern explanations trace writing back to clay tokens used for accounting. Perhaps that is true in part, but tokens are not writing. A token refers to a thing. Writing refers to sounds, concepts, abstractions, grammatical relations. The leap remains immense, and in the archaeological record, it feels abrupt. The Sumerians did not say they invented writing. They attributed it to Nisaba, goddess of grain and scribal knowledge, sometimes to Nabu in later traditions. The point is not the precise divine office. The point is the recurring pattern. Foundational knowledge is received. It enters the world complete enough to function. It is taught. It is preserved. It is not narrated as gradual human improvisation. The same pattern appears with the wheel. Around 3,500 BCE wheel technology emerges in Sumerian contexts. Potter's wheels first, then transport wheels, then applications spread. Archaeology does not hand us a comfortable museum drawer full of failed attempts and unusable prototypes. What we see are wheels that work. Wheels immediately competent enough to be adopted across domains. Again, the Sumerians credit divine instruction. Again, the technology appears not as a hesitant first try, but as functioning design, and then irrigation. Here the matter becomes even stranger because southern Mesopotamia is not an easy landscape for civilization. It is hot, flat, flood-prone, poor in stone timber and metal ore. The rivers can nourish, but they can also destroy. The soil, once irrigated badly, can accumulate salt and fail. This is not the kind of place where a fragile experiment in urban life ought to flourish first. unless somebody has already learned how to make water obey. But make it obey they did. Canals, distribution systems, managed flow, gradients calculated well enough to carry water outward without collapsing the channels or drowning the fields. The myths attribute this to Enki, lord of freshwater wisdom and craft. The texts describe him not only as divine, but as a giver of technique, a founder of workable systems. Eridu stands quietly inside this puzzle, one of the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, perhaps the oldest city in Sumerian memory, a place the texts themselves treat as primordial, a temple rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spot, layer upon layer, 17 phases of continuity. The Sumerians said Eridu was first. Archaeology, without endorsing their cosmology, confirms at least this much: Eridu is astonishingly early, astonishingly continuous. And then there is the flood. Not ordinary floods, which Mesopotamia knew well. The flood, singular, civilization ending in memory, if not in geology. Texts repeated in different forms. The Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, the flood episode embedded in Gilgamesh. The details vary, but the structure remains. Before catastrophe, cities and kingship. Then overwhelming water. Then survival, restoration, reestablishment. Archaeology cannot confirm a global flood. It does not need to. What it does show is regional flooding severe enough in parts of Mesopotamia to leave thick sediment layers and visible breaks in settlement patterns, enough to devastate irrigation systems, enough to bury fields, enough to force rebuilding on a civilizational scale. And if rebuilding were necessary, then the texts start sounding slightly different. Not like fantasies about a world that never was, but like memory trying to describe the difference between what existed before disaster and what had to be restored after it. This matters when the king list gives impossible reign lengths before the flood and ordinary reign lengths after it. Perhaps the numbers are symbolic. Perhaps. But perhaps also the scribes copied measurements from an older system they preserved without fully understanding. Sumerian scribal culture valued accuracy over comfort. If an old line remained obscure, it was copied anyway. If a number was inherited, it was preserved. The duty was transmission. And that may be the most revealing pattern of all. The Sumerians positioned themselves again and again, not as inventors standing at the dawn of everything, but as inheritors, stewards, rebuilders, custodians of a knowledge older than their present city walls. The Anunnaki, the flood, the me, the first cities, the restored temples, the recalculated canals, the rewritten king lists, all of it circles the same quiet claim. We received this. We did not begin it. We carried it forward. The question then is no longer only why civilization appears quickly in the archaeological record. The question becomes whether the people living inside that suddenness were trying to tell us something very simple. Not that gods dropped magic from the sky, in the modern, sensational sense. Something quieter than that. Something harder to dismiss. That what we call the beginning may already have been a recovery. Look at a clock, any clock. Digital analog, a clock tower, a watch face, a phone screen glowing in your hand in the dark before dawn. It does the same thing every clock does. It divides time into hours, minutes, seconds, 60 seconds, 60 minutes. The pattern feels so natural that we forget it is not natural at all. There is no minute in nature, No second waiting in the riverbank or hidden inside a stone. These are not discoveries like mountains. They are constructed units, designed, chosen, preserved. And the design comes from Mesopotamia. The sexagesimal system base 60 appears in Mesopotamian mathematical practice, not as a toy, not as a side experiment, not as one possible scheme among many, but as a working standard. Scribes learned it in school. They copied multiplication tables in it. They used it to divide land, to calculate grain, to track celestial cycles, to structure angle and time. And the first odd thing about base 60 is that it is not obvious. Base 10 feels obvious because human bodies carry 10 fingers into the act of counting. Base 60 does not announce itself through anatomy. It has to be taught, which makes the system even more interesting. Because what is difficult to invent casually can nonetheless be brilliant once fully in place. 60 divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Also by 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That matters more than it first seems to matter. Half of 60 is 30, a third is 20, a quarter is 15, a fifth is 12, a sixth is 10. Fractions become manageable, practical, elegant. If you are surveying, scheduling, distributing, partitioning, measuring, building base, 60 behaves beautifully. But that elegance does not explain its origin. It explains its survival. The Sumerians counted in one way and calculated in another. Everyday speech could move through familiar numerical habits, but mathematics used the sexagesimal framework. That means training, institutional training, repeated instruction. You do not stumble into a civilization-wide split between common counting and specialized base 60 calculation by accident. Someone teaches it. Someone preserves it. Someone insists it is the correct way to divide the world. The tablets bear this out. Mathematical school texts survive. Multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, exercises, corrected student work, clay homework from nearly 4,000 years ago. On one tablet, a student calculating the area of a field makes an error, and a teacher marks the correction. It is almost painfully familiar. A classroom, a method, a standard. The knowledge is not incidental. It is formalized. Why 60 modern mathematics gives one answer. Because it is extraordinarily useful. The Sumerian texts give another. Because that was the order handed down. Because Enki and Nisaba and the divine keepers of measure established the framework. The modern answer and the ancient answer do not quite cancel each other. One explains efficiency, the other explains authority. A system this subtle and this powerful needs not only to work, but to be protected from casual alteration. Divine attribution provides that protection. If this is the order of the gods, the scribe does not improvise. He learns. That conservatism may be one reason the system lasted. From Sumer to Babylon, from Babylon through later empires, base 60 remained embedded in the measurement of time and angle. Cultures changed, languages changed, dynasties rose and fell. But nobody found a better practical replacement for dividing circles and hours. Even when people tried. During the French Revolution, decimal time was proposed. 10-hour days, 100-minute hours, rational on paper, awkward in life. It did not endure. Base 60 remained because Base 60 solved the problem more gracefully. This is not just about clocks. It is about the circle, too. 360 degrees, 6 times 60 degrees divided into minutes of arc minutes into seconds. Your latitude and longitude. The geometry of navigation. The protractor in a classroom. The compass in engineering. The coordinate framework beneath global positioning systems. All of it still breathes the old Mesopotamian division. And that means something important. The inheritance is literal, not metaphorical. When your device tells you where you are, when your map calculates direction, when your day is portioned into appointments and delays and intervals, you are not merely honoring ancient history. You are actively using an ancient mathematical decision because it remains good engineering. The Sumerians said they received such knowledge. Modern scholarship says they developed it in response to practical needs. Again, perhaps both statements belong to different layers of the same truth. Practical needs alone do not guarantee elegant solutions. Many societies need to divide land and time. Not many arrive at a durable Base 60 system so refined that 4.5 millennia later, humanity still organizes its hours by the same invisible architecture. And this is where the old question returns, not as spectacle, but as pressure. How did they get it right so early, not approximately right, not symbolically right, right enough that the world still runs on it? The hymns to Nisaba speak of measuring rods and styluses of accounting, and order of the divine dignity of exactness. The myths about Enki do not present wisdom as vague inspiration. They present it as specific, transferable operative, a body of knowledge, a set of methods, something like what the Sumerians called the me. If mathematics is infrastructure knowledge, the knowledge beneath architecture, astronomy, irrigation administration, then it fits the pattern perfectly. It is not ornamental, it is foundational. And foundational knowledge in Sumerian literature always arrives from before. This is why the issue is harder than it first appears. The question is not whether Base 60 works. It does. The question is not whether later civilizations improved certain applications. They did. The question is why the earliest securely documented system appears already sophisticated, already institutional, already operating as if it had a past behind it. Why does the record open not with stumbling experiments, but with competence? You can answer that through gradual development, whose evidence is lost. You can answer it through cumulative innovation concentrated in temple schools. You can answer it through mythologized memory of earlier teachers. The Sumerians themselves answered it through instruction from the Anunnaki, through knowledge received, codified, and preserved. What matters most here is not which answer feels modern enough to be safe. What matters is that every time you wait 60 seconds, every time you quarter an hour, every time you measure an angle, you are moving inside a system that has already passed the longest test engineering can face: persistence. The system endured not because it was ancient, but because it was effective. The clay tablets are old. The mathematics is current. And if current life still depends on a structure first formalized in Sumer, then the old Sumerian claim becomes difficult to ignore. They did not think they were inventing time. They thought they were preserving it. If time is one inheritance, geometry is another. Quieter perhaps because angles rarely announce themselves. Walls do not speak. Foundations do not tell you whose mathematics they trust. A building only stands or fails. A canal only holds or breaks. A survey only aligns or drifts. Geometry is like that. It is indifferent to interpretation. It does not care whether you call it human genius or divine instruction. If the numbers are right, the structure lives. Which brings us to a damaged clay tablet in Columbia University's collection. Plimpton, 322, acquired in the early 20th century, probably from Larsa in southern Iraq. Broken at one edge. Rows of cuneiform numbers. At first glance, not much to look at. But once analyzed, the tablet revealed something extraordinary. It contains sets of numbers we now call Pythagorean triples. Integer relationships that define right triangles. The kind school children meet through the familiar example of 3, 4, 5. The kind engineers still use whenever square corners matter. The tablet dates to around 1800 BCE. Pythagoras lived more than 1,000 years later. That fact alone is arresting, but it is not the deepest part of the puzzle. The deeper part is that the tablet does not look like a discovery in progress. It looks like use. The numbers are arranged systematically. The triples are not childish examples. They are sophisticated, generated apparently by method, organized as though the scribe needed them available for practical reference, perhaps for surveying, perhaps for construction, perhaps for teaching trained users how to implement a known system. In other words, the mathematics appears already mature. That pattern is familiar now. Mature writing, mature timekeeping, mature irrigation, mature geometry. Another tablet from Mesopotamia gives an approximation for the square root of 2 to astonishing precision. Not symbolic precision, operational precision, close enough that the value remains recognizable as serious calculation by any modern standard. Why would anyone in ancient Mesopotamia need that number? Because if you understand the diagonal of a square, you understand something essential about measurement and construction. A square courtyard, a building plan, a field division, a diagonal bracing line. All of this depends on relationships that are invisible until mathematics makes them usable. What matters is not simply that the Sumerians and Babylonians could do these calculations. What matters is that they were doing them in ways that suggest algorithmic reasoning. Step-by-step procedure. Rule-based generation. Method that can be taught, repeated, copied. This is not mystical numerology. It is applied mathematics in a literate administrative civilization. And yet again, the archaeological record opens in competence. The earliest mathematical tablets already assume place value and sexagesimal reasoning. The scribal schools already assume training. The technical demands of city life already assume exactness. So the problem repeats in another domain. How do you move within a relatively narrow window from village accounting to methods capable of generating right triangle tables and precision square roots? One answer is practical necessity. Fields must be measured, temple foundations must be laid out, urban plans require right angles, builders need techniques that work. That is all true. But practical necessity exists in many human societies. It does not automatically yield trigonometric sophistication. Something in Mesopotamia did more than merely need geometry. It institutionalized it. And the Sumerians, or those who wrote from within the tradition, they attributed that institutional knowledge to divine teachers. Enki, Nisaba, the keepers of wisdom and exactness, not because every calculation was imagined as a miracle, but because the system itself was received as part of the deeper order of civilization. This is easy to dismiss if we flatten the ancient world into superstition. Harder if we notice how relentlessly functional the results were. A temple wall that remains upright is not a metaphor. A city plan aligned by correct angles is not symbolic. A field properly measured can be taxed, inherited, irrigated, defended. Geometry is governance wearing numbers. That is why Plimpton 322 matters so much. Not because it proves a sensational theory, but because it shows the level at which ancient Mesopotamian mathematics was operating. It was not wandering toward form. It had form. It had method. It had enough continuity behind it that the tablet reads like a tool in the middle of a tradition, not the accidental birth of one. And once more, the Sumerian framing becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. They said knowledge like this was taught, passed down, established by beings or sources older than ordinary human memory. Maybe that was theological language wrapping cumulative discovery. Maybe it preserved memory of earlier cultures. Maybe it was humility before systems so elegant they seemed received rather than invented. But whatever interpretive language we choose, the practical fact remains the same: the mathematics worked. It worked well enough that later civilizations preserved it. Greek geometry did not arise in a vacuum. Babylonian astronomy did not arise from nowhere. Medieval and modern engineering inherited not only isolated formulas, but a deeply rooted confidence that measurable space can be ordered, divided, and built upon through number. That confidence is already present in Mesopotamia. So, when you stand inside a building, when you trust a right angle without thinking, when carpenters square a frame, when surveyors triangulate distance, when architects model load and span, you are living inside the continuation of a very old victory. The victory is not merely intellectual, it is structural. The world holds because the numbers hold. And numbers like these do not survive for millennia through reverence alone. They survive because error would reveal itself immediately. A false theology can persist in abstraction. A false geometric system cannot hold up a roof for long. If the Sumerian and Babylonian calculations had been poor, the buildings would have slumped, the alignments drifted, the fields been mismeasured, the disputes multiplied, the system abandoned. Instead, the opposite happened. The system remained. So perhaps that is why the old texts speak the way they do. Not because ancient people were incapable of distinguishing between symbol and utility, but because utility on this scale felt sacred. A method that repeatedly produces order where disorder would otherwise reign becomes more than a trick. It becomes civilizational trust. And then the old question returns yet again from another angle. If the geometry appears already systematic when it enters the written record, if the tablets look like instruments of use rather than records of discovery, if the numbers remain correct after 4,000 years, then how far back does the learning go? The Sumerians answered that with names: Enki, Nisaba, the Anunnaki. We answer with theories. But neither name nor theory alters the right triangle. The angle remains right. The wall remains standing. The mathematics remains true. That is not mythology. Not exactly. It is what survives when stories and stones are both put to the test. Geometry is the quiet inheritance that built the world one measured corner at a time. And Mesopotamia very early had already learned how to trust it. The sky, too, became a tablet. That may be the strangest part, because it is one thing to imagine early cities learning to count grain, divide fields, measure walls. Those are immediate pressures, close pressures. The body feels them. Hunger feels them. Construction feels them. But the sky is farther away. The sky asks patience. It asks continuity. It asks a civilization capable of looking up night after night, year after year, generation after generation, and refusing to let the pattern dissolve into wonder alone. Mesopotamia did that. The series known as Enuma, Anu, Enlil preserves thousands of celestial omens and observations. Lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, planetary appearances, halos around the moon, weather signs, unusual lights, rising stars. The interpretive layer often feels strange to modern minds. If this eclipse happens, the king will suffer. If that planet nears those stars, a city will prosper or fall. Fine, the predictive politics may be superstition, but the observational foundation beneath it is another matter entirely. The observations are often accurate, the timing is often precise. The record keeping is real. Consider the Venus tablet associated with the reign of Amisaduqa. It tracks the appearances and disappearances of Venus as morning and evening star over a span of years. First visibility, last visibility, intervals, repetition, variation. Venus is not easy if you merely glance at the sky and call it beauty. Venus becomes legible only through sustained observation and organized notation. Its cycle relative to Earth repeats with complexity. To track that requires memory outside the body. It requires writing. It requires mathematics. It requires institutions that care enough to preserve the results. And Mesopotamia had all three. This is why later historians of astronomy still use these tablets, not because the ancient interpretations were scientifically correct in every sense, but because the data itself is good enough to work with. Good enough to help reconstruct chronology. Good enough to compare against modern back calculation. Good enough to matter. The same is true of eclipse knowledge. The Babylonians, building on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, recognized the cycle we call the Saros, roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat in related patterns. That recognition does not happen in a single lifetime, unless earlier observations are already available. It implies institutional continuity. Someone observes, someone writes, someone stores, someone teaches, someone compares. The civilization remembers, and again the old pattern returns. The texts describe the heavens as organized, measured, assigned, ordered by divine intelligence, Anu, Enki, Shamash. The names vary with function, but the core claim is stable. Celestial order is not random. It is established. Humans learn it, then preserve it. This language can sound purely religious until you notice how technical it becomes. The heavens are divided. The calendar is set. The positions of stars are fixed in relation to cycles that can be tracked. This is not merely praise. It is a way of saying that the cosmos operates according to a pattern subtle enough to be taught and stable enough to be calculated. Why does that matter practically? Because calendars are civilization. Agriculture depends on timing. Floods depend on timing. Festivals depend on timing. Tax collection depends on timing. Travel, warfare, harvest, ritual, storage administration, All of it requires populations to agree, not only on what time is, but on when the year is. A lunar month is visible to anyone. A solar year governs the seasons. Aligning the two is not automatic. It takes correction, intercalation, rule. The Babylonians and their predecessors developed those rules. Add months when needed. Keep lunar cycles aligned with solar reality. Do not let the calendar drift beyond use. This is not speculative mysticism. It is bureaucratic survival written against the sky. And still we return to the same puzzling feature. The knowledge appears in organized form very early. Mature enough to be practical, stable enough to persist, precise enough to matter. The observations are embedded in a world that attributes them to the Anunnaki, or to the gods who structured heaven and earth. Whether you hear that as theology or source memory, the functional outcome remains unchanged, an astronomical tradition capable of prediction. Prediction is the crucial word. Wonder sees the stars. Science, in its oldest operative form, predicts them. If you know where Venus will appear, if you know when the moon will darken, if you know how to keep months aligned with seasons, then you have moved beyond reverence into control. Not total control, of course. Human beings do not control the sky, but they can control their coordination around it. And that changes everything. Later civilizations inherited this. Greek astronomy learned from Babylonian astronomy. Medieval scholars preserved and extended what earlier ages recorded. Modern orbital mechanics still measures angles in the same ancient divisions. GPS still depends on coordinate frameworks born from the same sexagesimal inheritance. Calendars still preserve the logic of calculated correction. The names change, the instruments improve, but the skeleton remains. So, the matter is not whether Bronze Age Mesopotamians had telescopes. They did not. The matter is whether naked eye astronomy, joined to mathematics and writing, can produce an enduring predictive system. The answer is yes. The tablets prove it. And once again, that proves something quietly difficult. The people who recorded these systems were not guessing in the dark. They were operating within an established technical culture. The Sumerians and Babylonians did not say, "We have mastered the sky through our own genius." They said, "The heavens were ordered first, then taught." The calendar was established, first then kept. The stars were assigned their courses, then observed. To a modern ear, this sounds like mythic personification. Perhaps it is. But perhaps mythic personification in this case is what institutional memory sounds like when it survives thousands of years. A way of saying the framework came before us, and every time you open a calendar app, every time you note an eclipse, every time a date coordinates millions of human actions at once, you stand inside that framework. The device in your hand feels modern because its surface is modern, but beneath its surface is a far older idea. That time can be synchronized across populations by celestial pattern. That cycles can be tracked. That correction can be calculated. That order can be written down and handed forward. This is what the tablets predicted. Not only the sky, but the future persistence of the knowledge itself. 4,000 years later, the eclipses still repeat. The calendar still corrects. The old measurements still function. The Sumerians called that inherited order divine. We call it astronomical infrastructure. But the difference once again is attribution. The sky still obeys the mathematics. and the mathematics first reached written permanence in Mesopotamia. Water is less forgiving than stone and less patient than the sky. Stone can sit in error for a while before it cracks. Astronomical mistakes may reveal themselves only over seasons or years, but water exposes ignorance quickly. A bad canal silts up. A poor gradient erodes. A misjudged branch deprives one field and drowns another. A civilization that depends on irrigation cannot afford romantic mistakes. It needs engineering. Southern Mesopotamia needed it more than most places. The Tigris and Euphrates gave the region life, but not the easy kind. Their flooding was less predictable than the Nile's. Their channels shifted. Their waters had to be coaxed outward and managed continuously. Too little water meant failure. Too much water meant failure. Water left standing could salt the soil. Water moving too fast could tear channels apart. Supporting large urban populations under such conditions required not just effort, but hydraulic intelligence. The archaeological record shows canal networks stretching across the landscape in complex patterns, not random ditches, not hopeful trenches, but systems. Main channels, secondary branches, settling areas, distribution points, controlled gradients, maintenance pathways. These are the traces of people who understood in practical terms how water behaves through distance. And the texts reflect the same world. Administrative tablets record labor details for dredging, repairing, clearing, maintaining canals. Officials allocate workers. Authorities adjudicate water disputes. Field areas are calculated in relation to water delivery. The canal is never merely a feature of the land. It is a managed line of power. Whoever controls flow controls food. Whoever understands flow can build a city where no city should easily stand. This is one reason Enki matters so much in Sumerian literature. Enki is associated with freshwater wisdomcraft planning. His temple at Eridu, the Abzu, sits over the idea of deep water itself, the freshwater source beneath the earth. In mythic terms, he emerges from the hidden reservoir. In technological terms, he becomes the divine patron of everything civilization must understand to survive in southern Mesopotamia: water, method, design. The temple complexes themselves reveal how integrated that understanding was. Water channels in sacred architecture, basins, drainage, ritual cleansing linked to practical water management. What feels symbolic on the surface often rests on literal hydraulic design below. The sacred and the technical are not separated because the civilization could not afford to separate them. Life depended on systems working. The Gudea cylinders make this especially vivid. Gudea, ruler of Lagash, describes temple building in language that is devotional, certainly, but also exact. Canals are dug. Pure water is directed. Measurements are given. Materials are specified. The text is not a modern engineering manual, but it is close enough that you can still feel the project report inside it. A sacred building is impossible without managed water. Therefore, sacred instruction and hydraulic planning appear together. Again, the question is not whether Mesopotamians believed their gods cared about canals. Of course they did. The more interesting question is why the systems they attributed to divine teaching were so effective. Some canal networks operated with maintenance and modification for centuries. Cities depending on them endured. Agriculture scaled upward. Populations grew. This is not what failing design looks like. Hydraulic engineering has not fundamentally escaped these constraints. Modern irrigation still calculates slope volume erosion risk, distribution fairness, sediment, control drainage, salinization. The materials have changed. The measuring instruments have changed. The equations are formalized differently. But water has not changed. Gravity has not changed. Silt has not changed. The logic remains continuous. That continuity is why the old Mesopotamian systems matter. They are not interesting simply because they are old. They are interesting because they solved a difficult environmental problem so effectively that later cultures kept modifying the same landscapes according to the same general principles. Babylonian, Persian, Islamic, and modern water management in the region all move through a terrain already shaped by very ancient hydraulic intelligence. And this is where the Sumerian claim becomes more than literary decoration. They said they were taught. They said the knowledge came from before. They said the foundational order was established by beings or forces they named in divine terms. If one strips away the names and keeps only the function, what remains is a civilization explicitly presenting itself as the steward of inherited hydraulic knowledge. Could that simply mean accumulated human observation over generations? Certainly, it may mean exactly that. But if so, the Sumerians themselves chose to narrate cumulative observation as transmission from a deeper source. They did not celebrate the canal as spontaneous invention. They positioned it as received order preserved through labor and administration. This matters because irrigation is one of the hardest things to fake in retrospect. A text can exaggerate. A king can boast. A myth can ornament. But a field either receives water or it does not. A population either survives on managed agriculture or it does not. The cities of Sumer were not rhetorical. They were fed, which means the networks worked. Once more, we find the same pattern in a different material. The writing works, the time system works, the geometry works, the astronomy works, the irrigation works. Again and again, the knowledge that the texts attribute to divine or pre-human sources turns out to be technically sound. And perhaps this is why the old stories refuse to disappear. Not because they prove what sensational readings want them to prove, but because they keep pointing to a simple, difficult fact. The origin claim and the functional evidence sit uncomfortably close together. The people who built the canals said they inherited the underlying order. The canals themselves are good enough to make that statement worth pausing over. Imagine then the continuity hidden in something as ordinary as water moving through a channel. A farmer opening a gate. A measured slope carrying flow to a field. A dispute resolved because allocation is known. A maintenance crew dredging silt according to a record. That is not just labor, it is civilization as repeated hydraulic memory. The Sumerians wrote that memory into clay. They named Enki. They named the flood. They named the first cities. They named the me. They described the world as if its most important systems had arrived before the present and had to be preserved against loss. In a landscape where one catastrophic flood could erase years of work, that way of thinking makes a grim kind of sense. Water gives life. Water destroys. What survives is the knowledge of how to bring water back under form. And that knowledge still lives. Every modern irrigation engineer would recognize the problem set. Every canal still negotiates the same physics. Every water system remains an argument against chaos. So when the Sumerians said the Anunnaki taught humanity how to channel water, perhaps the least interesting response is to laugh. The more interesting response is to look at the canals, then look at the texts, and ask why the inheritance remains so visible. Water still flows. The cities built on that fact are dust. The knowledge is not. There is a Sumerian word that keeps returning like a key that does not quite fit any lock we possess. Me. Scholars translate it in different ways: divine powers, foundational principles, decrees of civilization, attributes of order. All of those translations are helpful. None of them is sufficient. Because in the text, the me do not behave like abstractions. They behave like things. Countable things. Transferable things. Things that can be possessed loaded, carried away, withheld, redistributed. That strangeness becomes impossible to ignore in the myth often called Inanna and Enki. In the story, Inanna travels to Eridu, where Enki receives her with hospitality and drink. In his intoxication, he grants her the me. Not one or two, but many of them, over 100 in some recensions. The list is remarkable for its range: kingship, priesthood, truth, judgment, metalwork, building, weaving, scribal craft, governance, sexual roles, music, law, victory, lamentation, procession, wisdom, decision-making. The texture of civilization itself appears itemized. Then the story becomes stranger still. Inanna does not simply receive blessing or approval. She takes the me away. She loads them onto her boat. Enki later regrets it, sends his servant after her, tries to retrieve them, fails, and Inanna arrives at Uruk with the me intact, where they become the possession of her city. If you read that as pure myth, it is still vivid. Political rivalry between Eridu and Uruk, dramatized as divine transfer. Old authority ceding to new urban power. But the language of the text keeps tugging towards something more concrete. Why list so many domains so specifically? Why describe transport? Why treat civilization not as a mist of vague blessings, but as a cargo? What if the me were knowledge packages, not mystical in the simplistic sense? Practical. A domain of systematized knowledge held in a transmissible form. The me of metalwork would then mean not simply the existence of metal, but the techniques required to identify ores smelt, alloy shape, and apply them. The me of writing would mean not some abstract reverence for signs, but the script, the conventions, the training, the scribal methods, the tablets and styluses and schools that make written language operational. The me of kingship would mean not merely a crown, but a whole governing framework: succession legitimacy, law, taxation, military command, ritual, office administration. Seen this way, the list becomes astonishingly coherent. Civilization appears not as one thing, but as a bundle of distinct interlocking capacities. Each can be taught, each can be preserved, each can be lost, each can be moved from one city to another if accompanied by records, specialists, rituals, tools, and institutional authority. In other words, each can behave exactly the way the me behave in the texts. This interpretation does not require us to flatten the myth into literal inventory. It only asks us to take seriously the Sumerian habit of describing foundational knowledge as transferable. The Emi are not passive blessings. They are active capabilities. And this matches the archaeological reality more closely than one might expect. Metalwork is real, writing is real, organized priesthood is real. Law codes, administrative roles, temple offices, monumental building weaving, industries, craft specialization, kingship itself. All of these are visible in the material and textual remains of Mesopotamian civilization. The list of the ME is not fantasy in the sense of inventing non-existent things. It is a catalog of actual civilizational functions. The myth claims those functions came from before and were brought into human cities through transfer. That is the pattern once more. Not invention first, inheritance first. Enki himself is not described as inventing everything from nothing. Often he is more like a steward-keeper-distributor. He possesses, he grants, he explains, he oversees. That matters, because it means even at the divine level, knowledge is not always imagined as spontaneous. It is held, ordered, passed along. And behind that ordered, passing along, stand the Anunnaki, the broader company of powers or beings from whom the civilizational framework descends. Whether you interpret that as theology, political memory, or encoded historical recollection, the structure is consistent. Civilization is modular. Its modules came from elsewhere. Human beings receive them and implement them. Now notice how modern life still works. We no longer call these domains me, but we still treat them as formalized knowledge systems: engineering, law, writing, medicine, architecture, governance, agriculture, accounting. Each requires training. Each has methods, institutions, and internal standards. Each can be transferred from teacher to student, from city to city, from culture to culture. Each is something you either know how to operate or you do not. In that sense, every modern profession is still a me in action. And the Sumerians were explicit about the source. They did not say, we gradually stumbled into all this and then retroactively decorated it with gods. Their literature repeatedly says the opposite. The systems were established first. Humans were brought into them later. That is why the me matters so much to this whole question. They offer a way to understand the Anunnaki traditions without immediately collapsing into either ridicule or sensationalism. If the Anunnaki represent the source of systematic civilizational knowledge, then the myths are not primarily about miracles. They are about transmission. The sacred enters history as protocol, as architecture, as writing, as law, as the know-how of organized life. It is possible, of course, that this is all metaphor, a culture honoring the accumulated inheritance of its own development by speaking of it as divine gift. But even that possibility admits something important. The Sumerians did not imagine civilization emerging as unstructured improvisation. They imagined it arriving in ordered domains. That intuition is extraordinarily sophisticated. It recognizes that civilization is not one invention. It is a matrix of interdependent competencies. And that matrix, in their own account, had predecessors. So when the king list speaks of kingship descending from heaven, when myths speak of the me being distributed, when later texts describe humanity managing systems established earlier, the repeated image becomes harder to ignore. Civilization for the Sumerians was not self-birth. It was uptake, reception, stewardship. The forms have changed since then, but the logic has not. You still wake into inherited systems. You do not invent law before breakfast. You do not create language anew each morning. You do not personally rediscover geometry, irrigation, accounting medicine, or administration. You inherit them as operative knowledge domains already waiting for use. The Sumerians called those domains me and said they came from the Anunnaki. We call them institutions or disciplines and behave as if their deep origin were less mysterious than it is. But perhaps it is not less mysterious. Perhaps it is simply more familiar. The me are still here, still being transferred, still structuring the world, still functioning. Whatever name you give them, they have never really left the boat. Return now to the prism, return to the clay, return to the beginning, because this story, like the king list itself, does not move in a straight line for long. It moves forward, yes, but it also circles back. It returns to earlier questions, carrying new pressure each time. In the museum vault in Oxford, the prism has not changed. The cuneiform signs remain where they were. The pre-flood kings are still impossible. The flood still comes in a single understated sentence. The post-flood world still resumes with shorter rains, different cities, a different scale of time. Nothing in the object has altered. What changes, perhaps, is the frame through which you look at it. At first glance, the problem seems simple. Ancient people exaggerated. Ancient kings were glorified. Numbers became symbolic. Fine, that explanation is possible. But after walking through timekeeping, geometry, astronomy, irrigation, and the explanation no longer feels complete. Because in every other domain, the civilization that produced this prism turns out to have been both technically serious and strangely insistent that its foundational systems were inherited rather than invented. So, perhaps the king list deserves the same patience. What if those enormous antediluvian rains are not ordinary years as we mean them? What if they preserve another scale now lost? Lunar counts, dynastic cycles, institutional durations, ceremonial totals, or simply numerical forms copied from older records whose original context had disappeared by the time later scribes preserved them. The Sumerians were conservative copyists. They did not casually normalize an old text to make it easier for posterity. They transmitted what they received. That matters because it means the absurdity may not be original invention. It may be inherited opacity. The scribes may have been as perplexed by some of these numbers as we are, but still unwilling to alter them. If so, the king list becomes even more interesting. Not as proof of supernatural kingship, but as evidence of a tradition preserving fragments of a chronology older than its own interpretive confidence. And then there is the flood. Again, not as spectacle, not as an argument about a planet-wide deluge. The more careful question is whether Mesopotamian memory preserved a civilizational rupture severe enough to separate before from after in ways that later literature could only describe through catastrophe. The archaeological sediment layers, the shifts in settlement, the changes in political pattern, the narratives of rebuilding. Put together, they create something unsettlingly plausible, not the end of the world perhaps, but the end of a world. If that is what the flood marks, then the post-flood sections of the king list begin to sound like restoration records. New cities taking on kingship, new reign lengths, a restarted scale, a civilization rebuilding itself from inherited patterns and preserved knowledge. Not inventing writing for the first time, but retaining it. Not inventing irrigation from nothing but re-establishing it. Not discovering order as though history began yesterday, but recovering what could still be recovered. And if that is so, the Anunnaki traditions shift as well, not necessarily into literal extraterrestrial beings, not necessarily into straightforward theology, but into something more historically resonant. A name for predecessors, a name for those earlier bearers of civilizational order. Whether those predecessors were human divine mythologized or some combination of all three, the Sumerians consistently placed the deepest origin of their functioning systems before themselves. That consistency is what matters. They say it in the myths. They say it in the hymns. They imply it in the king list. They encode it in the me. They repeat it through architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and kingship. Again and again, what matters most came from before. Now think of the ordinary morning. You wake and check the time. Base 60. You orient yourself in space. Degrees, minutes, seconds. You read messages, writing. You move through a city organized by law, planning administration, construction, measured distance, controlled water, professional specialization. Nearly every layer of ordinary life is made of inherited systems. Not all of them uniquely Sumerian, of course. Later civilizations transformed, refined, and extended them. But the remarkable thing is how often the earliest stable written form of those systems appears in Mesopotamia, accompanied by the claim that they were received. This is why the issue refuses to settle into either easy belief or easy dismissal. The prism does not prove the Anunnaki were literal beings descending from the sky in the way modern fantasy imagines. It does not prove the antediluvian kings ruled for hundreds of millennia in ordinary solar years. It does not prove a global flood. But it also refuses to behave like an irrelevant curiosity. It sits in clay beside a wider body of evidence, showing that the same civilization making these claims had in fact built durable operational systems that outlived its cities. And so the prism becomes something stranger than a relic. It becomes a point of return, a compressed statement of the whole Sumerian posture toward history. Kingship descended, it was held, it passed, it broke, it resumed. The origin lies above or before or beyond ordinary present memory. The duty of the scribe is not to solve the mystery, but to preserve the sequence. Perhaps that is why the object still feels so alive. Because we too live inside systems whose deep origins we barely question. We wake into order and call it normal. The Sumerians at least remembered to be astonished by inheritance. They remembered to say, "This did not begin with us." And maybe that is the point toward which the narrative keeps circling. Not whether every old claim can be proven in modern terms, but whether modern people can still recognize what it means to inhabit a received world. The prism is a small object, fired clay, dense quiet easily overlooked beside gold or marble. But inside, it is a way of seeing history that is both humbler and more unsettling than our own. Civilization is not self-made. Civilization is handed down, damaged, restored, transmitted, copied, sometimes misunderstood, but preserved because it still works. The clay remembers that. The cities did not survive. The technologies did. The names may remain uncertain. The inheritance does not. There is a detail in the Gudea cylinders that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Gudea describes being shown the plan for a temple, not merely inspired, not vaguely commanded, shown a plan, a drawn design, a visual arrangement with measurements and specifications. In other words, something very close to what we would call a blueprint. And then comes the revealing part. Gudea does not fully understand it. He needs interpretation, explanation, a mediator to tell him what the plan means and how it is to be implemented. That is a very different scene from the simple image of divine revelation as emotional certainty. It is technical transmission. A recipient receives knowledge beyond his immediate competence and requires guidance to make it operational. Even a ruler literate and educated within the scribal culture of his time cannot simply look at the design and build. He must be taught how to read the instruction. That pattern appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature too. Knowledge does not merely descend and instantly become usable. It is given, then interpreted, granted, then administered, revealed, then translated into procedure. The ME must be transferred. The astronomical order must be tracked. The mathematical methods must be learned in schools. The canal must still be dredged by laborers. Even received knowledge has to be embodied through institutions. Which tells us something very important. The Sumerian claim of inheritance is not laziness. It is not an excuse to avoid human effort. On the contrary, their texts assume hard work after reception. What came from before had to be preserved, interpreted, rebuilt, reapplied. Inheritance did not remove responsibility. It created it. This is one reason the Anunnaki question remains so difficult. If the Sumerians had been merely decorating ordinary human achievements with pious language, one might expect a looser pattern. Occasional divine credit, honorific references, ceremonial exaggeration. But what we see instead is systematic attribution at the origin level. Kingship descends, writing is given, measurement is taught, the heavens are organized, the me are distributed, irrigation is established. Again and again, the foundation is located elsewhere. The simplest modern response is to say that ancient cultures often attributed what mattered most to the gods. That is true, but it is not yet an explanation. Why these specific domains? Why this consistent relationship between divine origin and practical technology? Why are the systems that receive the strongest origin attributions also the ones that remain technically robust? Either the Sumerians were profoundly mistaken about the source of their most effective civilizational knowledge, or they were preserving some form of memory about knowledge coming from before their own visible horizon. Both options are strange. Both deserve more thought than either ridicule or blind belief usually allows. Perhaps the least distorted approach is to remain with the structure of the evidence. Advanced knowledge appears in the early Mesopotamian record already functioning. The people using it repeatedly describe themselves as heirs. Their texts frame the deepest origins of these systems as prior to themselves. Later civilizations inherit and preserve the same systems because they work. That is enough to make the old stories harder to dismiss casually. And it matters because the modern world often imagines inheritance poorly. We speak as though knowledge belongs to the present because the present uses it. We flatten the chain. We forget the length of transfer. But transfer is everything. No one invents civilization alone. No generation starts from zero. We are all downstream of someone else's calculations, someone else's measurements, someone else's way of dividing time-space, labor authority, and meaning. The Sumerians knew that. They made it explicit. They located themselves not at the point of pure beginning, but within a lineage of receipt and stewardship. They may have named that lineage through gods. They may have mythologized it. They may have encoded older historical memories in sacred language, but they did not forget the fact of dependence. This makes the idea of Anunnaki less sensational and more serious. Not necessarily little green men, not necessarily naive gods, but the formal acknowledgement that the civilizational operating system arrived from outside immediate human self-invention, from beyond the local present, from those who came before, or from those who came from beyond, or from those whose knowledge felt so refined that only divine language could carry it. And once again, none of this changes whether the systems function. That is the recurring anchor. If the source remains debated, the result does not. You can test the geometry, you can test the clock, you can test the calendar, you can test the hydraulics, you can test the administrative viability of writing, you can test the institutional power of transferable knowledge domains. The Sumerian inheritance survives every such test because later civilizations have spent thousands of years continuously retesting it in practice, which means the real inheritance is not merely a set of objects in museums, it is a set of methods still active. The prism, the tablets, the cylinders, the school exercises, the king lists, these are not the technology itself. They are records of the technology. The technology lives wherever time is measured. Walls are squared, water is directed, authority is organized, and writing stores memory outside the body. That is why the old texts retain their charge, because the things they claim to preserve are not dead. They are around you now. Their names may have changed. Their tools have evolved, but their core logic remains. The Sumerians said they did not originate that logic. They interpreted it, applied it, preserved it. So do we. And perhaps that is the most humbling possibility of all. That modern civilization, for all its confidence, may not be quite as self-originating as it likes to imagine. That what feels like progress may also be continuity. That beneath innovation lies transmission. Beneath novelty lies memory. Beneath the screen in your hand lies the old clay truth knowledge endures when it is copied well enough to survive those who first held it. The Sumerians copied. We inherit. The question is not whether the chain exists. The question is how far back the chain goes, and whether the first visible link is already part of a story much older than writing. By now, the question has folded back on itself several times, and that is appropriate. The original Sumerian material does the same thing. It circles, it restates, it approaches the same mystery through different forms: king lists, myths, hymns, technical texts, administrative records. Not because the culture was confused, but because the issue at stake was not simple. Where does civilizational order come from? How is it kept? What survives disaster? What can be handed forward? If you gather the fragments, the answer the Sumerians gave is remarkably consistent. Civilization comes as organized knowledge. It is established before the present generation fully understands it. It can be damaged, interrupted, or nearly lost. It can then be restored if preserved in records, institutions, and teaching lineages. The source of that organized knowledge is called divine, ancestral, antediluvian, or connected with the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Modern scholarship prefers different language, gradual development, social complexity, institutional specialization, environmental pressure. accumulated innovation. These are valid descriptions, but notice something subtle. Even in modern terms, civilization still depends on inherited systems. Writing requires trained users. Mathematics requires preservation. Astronomy requires long baselines. Law requires continuity. Architecture requires reliable transmission of technique. Irrigation requires repeated maintenance according to remembered principles. In that sense, the deepest modern explanation is not the negation of inheritance. It is another account of inheritance, which means the real disagreement may be less about whether knowledge is handed down and more about how far back the handoff reaches and what language should be used for its earliest source. This is why the Sumerian material continues to unsettle. Not because it gives us easy answers, but because it refuses a comforting modern mythology of spontaneous emergence. The technologies that anchor civilization appear in Mesopotamia with startling force and coherence. Writing, base 60, geometry, calendrical astronomy, large-scale irrigation, temple planning, administrative systems, formalized kingship. The Sumerians did not tell the story of these things as if they had appeared from nowhere through their own solitary brilliance. They told it as receipt. Receipt from whom? Receipt from what? That is the question that keeps returning. Perhaps the Anunnaki are best understood as a memory structure, a way of saying that civilization came from beyond immediate experience and that its forms were authoritative before the current generation could justify them independently. Or perhaps the term preserves, however mythologized, some memory of older teachers, older settlements, older systems buried by flood silt collapse or time. Or perhaps for the Sumerians no clean line existed between divine and historical source, because what mattered most was not classification, but legitimacy and fidelity. This is the order we received, therefore we preserve it. That last possibility deserves more respect than it usually receives. Ancient people were not obligated to use our categories. They could remember real transmissions in sacred language without thereby ceasing to remember them. They could embed practical knowledge in myth without thereby making it impractical. The line between religious and technical was not the line their civilization lived by. The canal and the hymn could belong together because both were part of sustaining order. And still the old test remains the strongest one. Function. A system that fails dies. A system that works persists. Sumerian core systems persisted. Not untouched, not unmodified, but recognizably continuous. The hour still has 60 minutes. The circle still has 360 degrees. Buildings still trust right triangles. Calendars still reconcile cycles. Writing still externalizes thought. Water still obeys gradients rather than desire. Authority still requires frameworks beyond individual whim. Civilization still depends on transferable domains of knowledge. This is what makes the inheritance silent. It is everywhere, and because it is everywhere, it is easy not to see. The more foundational something becomes, the less visible it appears. Nobody pauses in ordinary life to marvel that minutes are sexagesimal. Nobody usually notices that modern mapping still breathes ancient angular divisions. Nobody walking into a building thinks about the long continuity of geometric trust. Nobody scheduling a festival, an exam, a meeting, a harvest imagines the ancient sky watchers whose calculations helped make coordinated time possible. And yet the continuity is there. Quiet, total, structural. The Sumerians would not have found that strange. They believed civilization rested on systems larger than any one life. Systems one entered, served, transmitted, and then left behind. Kingship descends, priesthood passes, writing is taught, measure is learned, the me are born from place to place. One generation does not own them. One generation merely uses them well or poorly. That is an unusually mature vision of culture. It is also a humbling one. It denies the vanity of firstness. It reminds people that their greatest achievements may already be inherited frameworks applied with local intelligence. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians preserved impossible reigns and divine origins in the same corpus that preserves grain accounts and labor assignments. To them, there was no contradiction. The practical and the primordial belong to the same order. So when we ask whether the Anunnaki were real, perhaps the most useful first step is to ask what kind of reality the texts are concerned with. Not tabloid reality, not theatrical proof, structural reality, the reality of source. The reality of order, older than the individual. The reality of inherited systems that continue to operate even when their deepest origin has become obscure. By that standard, the Anunnaki question remains alive because the source problem remains alive. The systems still work, but their beginning is not fully transparent. The first written explanations we possess already speak of earlier transmission. The first visible stewards do not claim authorship, they claim inheritance. And perhaps this is the point to which every part of the narrative has been tending, not toward certainty, but toward a more disciplined astonishment. To look at the world you wake into and recognize that much of its deepest order was already old when history first learned how to write itself down. The Sumerians called that oldness by names. We inherit the order, but often not the names. The clay preserved both. So let us ask the question one more time slowly, because the answer depends on how the question is heard. The question is not whether the technologies work. They do. That has been the easy part all along. The mathematics works, the geometry works, the water management works, the writing works, the calendar works, the administrative logic works, the modular transfer of knowledge domains works. 4,000 years of continued use is not an argument from romance. It is an argument from performance. The question is also not whether the Sumerians really existed, whether the tablets are authentic, whether the prism is real, whether the texts say what they say. All of that is secure enough. The clay remains, the inscriptions remain. The translations may be revised at edges, but the broad pattern is not in doubt. The broad pattern is precisely what troubles the modern imagination. A civilization appears with extraordinary sophistication and repeatedly describes itself as inheriting the foundations of that sophistication. So the actual question is narrower and deeper. What did the Sumerians think they were preserving? If they were simply inventors, mythologizing their own genius, then their persistent refusal to take credit becomes interesting in itself. Why choose humility at the foundational level while being perfectly willing elsewhere to record kings, victories, buildings, and law? Why distinguish so sharply between human accomplishment in the present and civilizational origins in the deeper past? If, on the other hand, they were preserving some memory of earlier source cultures, earlier infrastructures, or earlier lineages of knowledge broken by catastrophe, then the king list, the flood traditions, the me and the divine attributions begin to line up as different expressions of the same memory. A world before, a rupture, a restoration, a body of knowledge not invented from zero, but recovered, retaught, or reapplied. Neither interpretation solves every difficulty. Both leave mysteries. But notice how both converge on one essential point: civilization begins in Sumerian consciousness as inheritance. And that convergence matters because it matches our own lived reality more than we often admit. You did not invent the language with which you think. You did not create the numerical base beneath your clock. You did not develop the geometric assumptions of the buildings around you. You did not discover the calendrical logic that coordinates the social year. You did not create the legal and administrative forms that structure collective life. You were born into them. They were waiting. Like the me, like kingship descending, like time already divided. This is not a mystical observation. It is simply true. But the Sumerians pushed it farther than we usually do. They insisted that the very first holders of these systems were not ultimate originators either. They too received. That is where the horizon opens. If every generation receives, then somewhere back there is a first visible transmission. The Sumerians located that transmission in the language of the Anunnaki. Those who came, those associated with heaven and earth, those connected with the first cities, the first kingship, the first ordering. We need not accept every literal reading to recognize the seriousness of the claim. The claim is that civilizational form entered human social life from beyond the ordinary present. It had authority before it had explanation. And perhaps that is why the old material still feels eerie, because modern life is full of systems we use confidently without being able to reconstruct their entire deep history. We trust inherited order. We rely on it. We refine it. We transmit it. But we do not always know where it first crossed the threshold into human use. The Sumerians at the edge of written history felt that same condition and gave it names. Their names may not solve our questions, but they may keep us from asking shallow ones. Maybe the antediluvian kings were never meant to be read as ordinary biological reigns. Maybe they mark continuities now lost to interpretation. Maybe the flood was regional catastrophe magnified into civilizational memory. Maybe the Anunnaki were divine in the full religious sense to the Sumerians and remain so only within that worldview. Maybe they were mythologized teachers. Maybe they were the cultural form memory took when faced with systems too ancient, too integrated, too effective to feel self-originating. But again, what matters most is not what theory feels most dramatic. What matters is that the inheritance remains demonstrable. If a claim leaves no trace, it can drift into speculation indefinitely. If a claim leaves a functioning clock, a functioning map, a functioning legal administrative tradition, a functioning geometry, a functioning calendar, a functioning hydraulic logic, then the claim deserves a different kind of attention. Not credulity, attention, because perhaps the Sumerians were trying to preserve exactly that distinction. They were not saying, believe everything without question. They were saying, in effect, this is what we received. This is how the order came to us. This is what still works. They preserved the impossible numbers and the practical calculations in the same civilizational archive, because to them, both belong to one continuity of transmission. The modern mind wants to separate them cleanly. Myth here, Engineering there, faith here, functionality there. But the clay does not always cooperate. On the clay, origin and operation remain entangled. The king list stands beside the administrative tablet. The hymn stands beside the mathematical exercise. The temple plan stands beside the labor roster. The world is ordered first, then managed. And if that is how the Sumerians saw it, then perhaps the most honest modern response is not to decide too quickly, but to notice the depth of the inheritance and the seriousness of those who preserved it. Civilization, they suggest, is older than its first surviving records. Its first surviving records already speak in the voice of memory. The prism remains where we began. Fired clay, 4 faces, tiny wedges, a catalog number in a museum vault. Nothing about it looks loud. Nothing about it looks modern. Nothing about it looks like infrastructure. And yet infrastructure is exactly what it points toward. Not because the prism itself measures your day, but because the world that made it still does. You wake in the morning and check the time. 60 minutes to the hour. 60 seconds to the minute. The old sexagesimal inheritance moving invisibly beneath your first act of awareness. You orient yourself in space. Degrees around a circle. Minutes and seconds of arc. The same inherited divisions. You read a message. Writing that ancient externalization of thought, now illuminated on glass, rather than pressed into clay, but still performing the same essential miracle. You move through buildings that trust right angles, load-bearing calculations, measured plans. You rely on calendars that coordinate collective life through celestial order. You eat food grown within hydraulic traditions, whose problems were already being solved in Mesopotamia. You live without noticing it inside a structure of continuity. That is the silent inheritance. The Sumerians saw it differently from us, or perhaps more honestly. They did not imagine themselves standing at the center of self-created civilization. They imagined themselves receiving preserving and extending systems whose origins reached beyond immediate human memory. They said kingship descended. They said the me were given. They said writing measure, astronomy, water order, and civic form came from the Anunnaki or from the divine powers associated with them. Their language is not ours. Their categories are not ours. But their core intuition may be closer to the truth than modern vanity likes to admit. No civilization invents itself from nothing. The impossible kings remain impossible. The flood remains difficult. The Anunnaki remain unresolved. That uncertainty is part of the story, not a flaw in it. The clay does not eliminate mystery. It preserves it, but it preserves something else as well. It preserves a civilizational self-understanding in which practical knowledge is older than the present and worthy of exact transmission. That transmission succeeded. That is why you are here, now still living with its results. Perhaps the antediluvian rains are measures we no longer understand. Perhaps the flood marks real catastrophe transformed by memory. Perhaps the Anunnaki are gods in the full ancient sense. Perhaps they are historical predecessors translated into sacred language. Perhaps they are a way of naming the simple fact that foundational knowledge feels as though it comes from elsewhere, because for every generation it does. It always comes from elsewhere. It always comes from before. Whatever interpretation one prefers, the systems themselves remain. And that may be the most important point to end on. The technologies attributed to the Anunnaki do not ask for belief in order to function. They ask only for use. The clock still divides, the map still locates, the wall still stands, the canal still carries, the calendar still synchronizes, the script still stores thought. The knowledge still transfers from teacher to student, from text to reader, from institution to institution, from age to age. That is not mythology, not in the dismissive sense. That is continuity, tested continuity, the longest-running engineering trial in human history. And perhaps that is why the old Sumerian material remains so difficult to put down, because it confronts us with a version of humility we are not practiced in. We are used to admiring innovation, less used to admiring preservation, less used to admitting how much of what sustains us is inherited from minds long gone, names, half-erased cities, buried worlds broken and rebuilt. The Sumerians at least admitted it. They said this came to us. We kept it. Use it carefully. The clay remembers. Not perfectly, not transparently, but enough. Enough to show us that the beginnings of recorded civilization already speak of deeper beginnings. Enough to show us that the first great urban record keepers in southern Mesopotamia believed themselves to be heirs. Enough to show us that the practical systems they preserved were good enough to outlive their language, their temples, their empires, even their names. So, no, the question was never simply whether the Anunnaki were real in the narrow modern sense. The question was always larger and quieter than that. What did the Sumerians inherit that still works? What did they preserve so well that the modern world continues to depend on it without noticing? What does it mean that the oldest written custodians of civilization insisted they were not its first source? Look again at the clock. 60 seconds have passed, then 60 more. Sumerian seconds, ancient divisions on a modern screen. The empires between you and them have all fallen. The mathematics did not. The names became obscure. The geometry did not. The temples became ruins. The writing changed shape, but not function. The cities were buried. The systems rose again and again in new forms because they solved the same human problems with the same enduring elegance. The prism in the vault cannot answer everything. It cannot prove who the Anunnaki were. It cannot settle every argument about the flood or the first kings or the oldest cities. But it can still do something important. It can remind you that civilization at its deepest level may be less about invention than about transmission, less about novelty than about fidelity, less about the pride of beginning than about the discipline of carrying forward what still works. And that is the inheritance you wake into every morning. The tablets may be myths. The inheritance is not. The clay may be silent. The systems are not. They are around you now, ticking, measuring, holding, flowing, organizing, remembering, still functioning, still dividing time, still shaping the world, still asking as quietly as fired clay can ask whether you are ready to recognize how old the order around you really is.